We are in the 1840s in Montgomery, Alabama. We have three women here, Anarcha, Betsey and Lucy. Three enslaved women who have a painful condition. Now they are going to come to the notice of a doctor called J. MARION Sims. He's going to go on to be the father of gynecology. But these women will be made to endure hundreds of surgeries in an intimate area without anaesthetic. This is their story. So let's enter this next guy. His name is J. MARION Sims. I know his name very well because a lot of things at medical school are named after him. The Sims speculum, there's a Sims position. This guy's legacy persists to this day. But I don't want to talk about him really. I want to talk about three women that he operated on / tortured. Their names were Anarcha, Betsey and Lucy. There are other women. They were a whole group of women that were kind of living in this encampment and having these experiments done to them. The only ones whose names are logged are the three women that we just spoke about. The other women's names and voices have been completely lost to history because Sims just did not care to write anything down about them. Like, their suffering is completely irrelevant to him. Now, Sims performed up to 30 operations on Anarcha without anaesthetic. 30. Digging into all of this. Now, these were enslaved women. They lived in Montgomery, Alabama. They suffered with a vesicovaginal fistula. Now, fistula is a communication between two spaces that really shouldn't communicate, like the vagina and the bladder, or the vagina and where the poo comes out, effectively. So what happens is, this typically happens in labour. It's very common. It does still happen today, but we would treat it in hospital. And we have all kinds of things that midwives do to try and prevent this happening in the first place. So when a baby's head pushes too long in the birth canal, the tissue that's stuck behind the body, usually the head, can die because it can't get any oxygen to it. And when that dies, it leaves a hole. So there is now a communication between two spaces. Now, if this is between the bladder and the vagina, that woman will then drip urine constantly. And because urine is an irritant, it will burn the skin on the thighs. And there can also be a passage between the vagina and the passage that, you know, the bowel and the passages. So you can get poo coming through the vagina as well. And you can imagine the stigma throughout history that these women have suffered. They are more predisposed to infection. But even aside from all of that, it can compromise her ability to have further children also. But there is such a stigma and social isolation that is associated with this. And that's not really why it was a problem to their slave owners. And we're going to be digging into that because that is the root of why these women go through this procedure so many times. In 1845, the first woman that I would like to talk about, Anarcha, goes into labour. So she's only 17 years old. And she struggles for 3 days without medical help. We already talked about how obstructed labour can cause things like fistulas. Now, she must have been in awful pain. You can presume that, you know, the slave owners weren't particularly free with, you know, sending doctors for slaves, and she struggles. And eventually she gets some help. Point to note at this point is that obstructed labour was reportedly quite common in enslaved communities because of the nutritional deficiencies that they had. They were more likely to suffer with things like rickets, pellagra, scurvy, and even anemia. Now, we cannot take Anarcha's labour at face value because there's more to unpick here. We know nothing of her suffering. We know nothing about her at all. But one thing we can surmise is that potentially her primary worth to her owners was in her capacity to reproduce. Now, in 1808, the transatlantic slave trade had been formally discontinued. The passing of a federal law which made it illegal to transport captive peoples from Africa to the United States of America. Now, there is an illegal slave trade which operates until 1860, and it's not fully outlawed until 1865. But what happens is, as these laws are passed, suddenly it becomes very difficult for slave owners to deal in the trade of slaves. So what do they need to do? They are looking at breeding them. So they want women like Anarcha to just breed. They're just treating them like livestock, effectively. You know, that is Anarcha's value, and we're going to see that with what Anarcha is made to endure later on. It's just there's never any, okay, let's take a step back. It's just we will keep pushing and pushing and pushing because she needs to do this thing that we need her to do. Come back to Anarcha's labour. Now, the baby is eventually delivered with forceps. These are the kind of little tongs that you use to pull the baby out. But we do know that the doctor writes that the baby is so impacted in the pelvis that the labour pains had almost ceased. So she's doing really badly by this point. We don't know if the baby survived because no one really cared to write that down. But we do know that Anarcha sustains a severe fistula. And there's another little historical aside I'd like to make at this point. There's a doctor called George Hayward and he's all operating the same field at roughly the same time. And he says it's difficult to examine women with this condition because of the exquisite sensitivity of the parts. So later we're going to talk about how people like MARION believe that black women don't experience pain in the same way as white women. But you've got someone like George Hayward who's saying, I was examining women with this condition and I found it difficult to do so because they were in so much pain. So we know that Anarcha was in pain. That is important not to forget. But of course, what is Anarcha now? She's now an economic liability. She's probably dripping urine, so she can't work in the house, she can't work in the fields, and the likelihood is she can't reproduce either. So Anarcha is now a problem that someone needs to do something about. Similarly, we come to Lucy. So Lucy is an 18-year-old enslaved woman. When she first meets Sims, she'd given birth about a month before, and she'd been unable to hold any water, so we know that there's a connection between the vagina and the bladder. And Betsey as well, Sims meets in hospital, and it seems like at first Sims refused to treat these women because there was, as in his words, there was no treatment for it. He wasn't interested in it. But the owners kept pushing. They wanted this fixed. So Sims thinks about it, and he creates a rudimentary speculum from a pewter spoon, and he uses it to examine Lucy with her consent, he writes. Now this is a thorny issue, the consent, because a woman with no rights and no autonomy can't really consent. The idea of consent, we'll come back to the consent because it's a thorny issue, but even if she could consent, even if we put aside everything else and say Lucy did consent, there's a real big difference to her having this awful fistula and saying, yes, you can examine me and maybe operate on me one time without anaesthesia, and her agreeing to do 20 surgeries without anaesthesia. These things just don't match up. Anyway, Sims examines her with the spoon, and he has a complete eureka moment. He's able to kind of look into the vagina for the first time to see the cervix, and suddenly he can see the problem. He can see the fistula, and now that he can see it, he thinks that he can fix it. Now, the Sims speculum we kind of still use today. It is very helpful, but you can't separate it from this legacy. Once he decides he's going to start trying to fix these fistulas or learn how to fix them, so all three of the women we've spoken about, Betsey, Lucy and Anarcha, come to live with him. That's how intense this is, okay? They're literally living with him so he can experiment on them. And 7 more women whose names we just don't know. Now, he promised their owners not to endanger their lives. That's really important. The reason that is because anaesthetic, it's ether anaesthetic, and these days there is a risk of death with that. So it's not like today. Even today we do lots of monitoring when we give you anaesthetic. He promises not to endanger their lives. So he feels confident that he can operate on them, on their vagina, with little danger of killing them, as long as he doesn't give them any pain relief, which is exactly what he's going to do. Just always, all the way through this second half of this video, is all about their objects. You know, you can borrow my car, but don't damage it. You know, and this is how these women are being treated, like they are cattle or a tractor. You know, it's just, there's never any consider for them as women, not ever. Now, Sims first operates on Lucy in December 1845. He's impressed with her resolve during the operation. Like, that was before the days of anaesthetics, he writes, and the poor girl on her knees bore the operation with great heroism and bravery. Well, she didn't really have a choice, does she? Now, anaesthetic is a fledgling field in this period. It's really in its infancies. But ether anaesthetic, though not perfect, is spreading in this period. We know that neighbouring state of Georgia is being used early as 1842, but the problem, as we've already discussed, is that it's dangerous and these women belong to someone. Now, Lucy's first operation goes well, but results in kind of a blood poisoning, and he doesn't manage to crack the fistula effectively. But he keeps going because he's got resilience, this guy, and he's got, you know, he's got an unlimited supply of women that he can just keep practicing on. So he does manage to kind of lessen the effect of the urine, but he doesn't cure it. Now, after modifying the technique, he then practices on Betsey, and again he improves the situation, but he does not cure it. There is no log of how these women feel. He then operates on Anarcha, but it doesn't make any difference, doesn't have fancy the other two. For the next 4 years, these same women are just subject to him practicing and practicing and practicing without anaesthetic. And it sounds like he becomes a little bit obsessed actually with the whole thing. And at first, people in the medical community are really supportive of him, but as we move towards pushing on for 4 years, the medical community is kind of abandoning him, and he doesn't even have any assistants anymore, and he has to rope in 2 of the other women to hold the 3rd woman down, the woman that's being operated on, and vice versa. Over the 4-year period, Anarcha has 29 operations before the 30th is successful or without anaesthetic. Never any logging about whether her child survived, whether she was separated from him so that this process could be created. Nothing, none of that. Let's talk legacy then, because legacy is difficult, isn't it? Because, especially with the medical field, because a lot of these guys, the same with Hunter and Smelly, is they created great atlases which helped, you know, generations of doctors have benefited from the medical science that these 3 guys created, but at what cost? And I just don't think that we can just blindly swallow the legacy because it ignores the suffering of all these women. I want to pick a little bit more at the legacy of J. Marion Sims, okay? Because maybe you could argue, and I think people, if you look on the internet, not generally on the internet, but in the medical community, people have been very defensive of Marion Sims. I was very surprised about this when I was doing the research into this video, but people are defensive of him. And they say, great things have come from what he did. We've benefited a lot as a world community. All right, just let me pick at that, just a little bit, okay. So we say, okay, anaesthetic, he didn't use anaesthetics, he didn't really exist, didn't want to kill the women, but he did all these wonderful things, fine. Okay, right. In 1851, Hayward, do you remember him? He publishes further evidence of having performed some 20 operations on obstetric fistula. And there is an article in the Boston Medical and Surgical Journal which provided detailed information about each of these operations. So a particular note is case 8, which he makes the patient insensible by ether on March 4th, 1847. So we can have the logic that Sims is doing these things because he needs to, because no one else has done it, and there's no anaesthetic anywhere, and he's done great things. But actually, in the journals, around the same time, there is another doctor who is doing the same things, who's publishing his research for anyone to look at, and he's using anaesthetic. Now, Hayward even goes on to log his process for using anaesthetic. He says there's 3 main advantages of using it, so the operation can be performed much more easily. I mean, you know, I am trained as a surgeon. I can absolutely promise you, you do not want to operate on a person who's not anaesthetized. The time taken to complete the operation is reduced from 1 hour to 20 minutes, he says, and can be completed without the slightest suffering to the patient. That is what is important to Hayward, and this is in 1851. This is the same time period. Now, in terms of the other part of the legacy of him creating these wonderful things, this incredible legacy, these procedures, and that he needed to kind of treat these women because anaesthetic wasn't available, and he needed to create this operation. Actually, Hayward first publishes his account in 1839, and there's a doctor called Mettauer, and he's publishing his successes in 1840. So Sims presents as a man trying to find a cure, but actually there's already good and credible information that's out there. He doesn't really need to break into this field. There is already this information that's being created by men who are using anaesthetic on their patients. So now when we think about that, it doesn't quite seem so much of this, we need to protect this legacy of this doctor that was doing the best thing that he possibly could to try and treat these women. You could say, well, maybe best one in the world, Marion Sims didn't know about these 2 doctors. But actually in his monograph of 1853, he mentions both Hayward and Mettauer and pays tribute to their work whilst promoting his own. So he knew. Cannot separate this part of the video with racial kind of ideology, the idea that black people are insensitive to pain. So these views might even persist today. They certainly went on into the 20th century. And in all of the research that I found, it's kind of the idea that Sims believed that these women felt less pain than a white woman did in this period. Now, I want to push back on that a little bit because potentially J. Marion Sims has operated on more unanaesthetized black people than anyone else that's potentially ever lived. This guy knew that they were in pain. You're not telling me in those hundreds of operations that he did, he hadn't observed that they were in awful, terrible pain, because I believe that just gives him a bit of a pass. I think he knew, and he just, you know, whatever he did. I find it very hard to believe that this guy didn't realize that these women weren't in pain or they could just push through. But anyway, 68, this is a fact for you, 68 years after the introduction of anesthesia, physicians are still using anesthesia sparingly on black people, and the idea of insensitivity to pain continues today. But this belief is actually not limited to black people. So there's a lot of information that this spreads to anyone who is considered racially inferior to white people, mainly Western white people, and does not include Irish people who are, I mean, any Irish people will tell you, who have been subjected to horrendous kind of racial abuse from specifically British people. There used to be signs, I think, in London saying like no dogs, no Irish. And interestingly, Sims, I've got two more patients to tell you about before we finish this video. Look at another patient of Sims. Now this lady is called Mary Smith, and she's a patient in his newly opened women's hospital, which opens in 1855. Now her first delivery had been in Ireland, where she experiences a prolapsed uterus. That means her uterus is coming effectively down through her vagina, and a herniated and prolapsed bladder, which means her bladder is also coming down, fecal incontinence, and urine leakage, and her vulva is rubbed raw. We understand why, because obviously that urine is just irritating everything. Now, upon examination, Sims declares a most offensive and loathsome object. That's what he calls Mary Smith. The kind of guy that he is, right? Sims and his junior colleague, Thomas Emmett, performed over 30 operations on Smith over a 6-year period, always without anaesthesia. This is in the 1850s, where we know that people are using ether. This women's hospital does not routinely administer anaesthetic until after the Civil War in 1865. Now, let's contrast that with another patient that he treats. This is a female patient in France. In 1861, he works with 5 other people. He performs 2 operations on a 21-year-old woman who's not named. And he writes that she is young, rich, beautiful, and accomplished, and that he'd never seen a case of this kind which was attended with such suffering. This woman, who he describes as belonging to the higher walks of life, and 6 months earlier he told her that her condition was incurable and she'd been praying for death ever since. Offered the chance of a cure, she allows Sims to perform 2 operations, and he recounts later on, which is really interesting, he recounts a complication of chloroform. So this woman, who he treats later, is offered chloroform, and she is a rich and beautiful woman. So J. Marion Sims does not even escape the idea that he just doesn't anaesthetize any women. It seems very likely that this rich French woman, this rich, young, beautiful French woman, receives chloroform. And of all the women we've looked at, she is the only one who is noticed to have had anaesthetic. Now, for almost 124 years, a statue of James Marion Sims was in New York. It was unveiled in 1894 when he was, you know, the absolute best. And then it was located in Manhattan's Bryant Park. It was relocated in 1934 to Central Park. And then in April 2018, it was relocated to where he's buried, which is Greenwood Cemetery in Brooklyn. Even now, people want the statue to kind of be buried with him, because I think we could and should appreciate that as much as he might have done for medical science, it is off the back of these bodies of Anarcha and Betsey and Lucy. And it's just not okay. And you know, I think we should rename the speculum, personally. You know, do names matter? Is it a similar thing? Actually, we have renamed things in medicine. There were things that were named after prominent Nazis the names have been changed recently. You know, it would be really nice to maybe rename it a Montgomery speculum to honour those women whose incredible sacrifice led to something that was not ever in their wish or grant and shouldn't have been taken. It's a lot like if you're aware of Henrietta Lacks. Again, is a very similar situation where an African-American woman basically has made an incredible contribution to science, but at what cost? At the cost of her autonomy, at the cost of her physical body. And in the cases of people like Anarcha and Betsey and Lucy, in the case of great suffering, it's all just incredible to think that these men kind of profess to be the fathers of obstetrics and gynecology, specialities, medical specialities that profess to help women and have helped women. But these men did not help women, they harmed them. This was a sobering video this week, guys. I hope you enjoyed it. More than that, I hope you learned something. I think it is important for us to remember these women, to remember what was done to them without their consent, and I'm looking forward to hearing your comments on the video. I hope that for any of you watching this, that you go away, forget the names of the doctors, remember Anarcha and Betsey and Lucy and, you know, Mary Smith and all of those pregnant women potentially who met with an awful fate in the name of medical science. And yeah, thank you so much. See you next week for, I was going to say a happier video, but I think we're going to be burning witches, so I'll see you then.